Hello and welcome everyone to the June edition of the BizTalk live talk show. If you're joining from my half of the world, then it might be July 1st, but if you're joining from most of the world, that is a day behind, then yes, we just scraped in for the end of June. So welcome all, thank you so much for joining. We've got a lot of awesome content to go through today, and as always, we're joined by our experts, Dan and Andrew, and of course, we're joined also on the call by John Panty and Derek Lee. So we'll be answering your Q&As as we go along. So going through what we have today on the agenda, we have a very busy agenda. We're going to be recapping how we got here today, where we are with the BizTalk Migrator tool. We're then going to be going through the feedback that you've been providing us over the last 6 months or so, and going through what's new and what's coming and to look forward to on the tool. So we've got some live demos of what you can look forward to, and we'll have a Q&A session at the end to talk through more of your questions if you have any. So really looking forward to the session today and hope you enjoy it. I'll pass over to Andrew now.
Hi, everyone. So before we start, one of the things that has really helped so far over the last few months is some amazing feedback we've had from people, particularly saying what their migration issues are, what the main features of BizTalk that they want to migrate. So please do, if you haven't done so already, please do fill in the survey, aka.ms/BizTalk migration survey, and it's your chance to give us some feedback and some insight into the problems that you're facing, so that hopefully together as a team we can all and as an open source project we can all help support you and get your migration journey as slick and as smooth as possible. The other thing is that hopefully you're trying to use the tooling to do some migrations, or at least to assess some migrations and to get the reports out on them. If you have any issues, again, the open source project is there, github.com/azure/aimtool/issues. If you have an issue, let us know, raise an issue, and we can then start working on those and getting those fixed. So we'd love it if you could at least do those two things. Let us know what issues you've had. Let us know by filling in the survey what are the most important things to you, and then we can see how we can best help you. So it'd be great if you could do that. So without further ado, let's move on to the recap of how we got to where we are today. So it feels like it's been quite a journey for BizTalk Migrator. The private preview started in June 2020. It was announced at the Integrate conference last year, and myself and Dan have been helping from the private preview and then through to the and then working with the open source project from the release in October 2020. So building on some the great work that was done behind the scenes with the Microsoft team up to that point, and the BizTalk migration tooling, it works with BizTalk MSIs. You have to have some way of packaging a BizTalk application, and the original thinking was that if we use the BizTalk MSI, it means that people that don't even have their source code and only have their app running in production can export an MSI, and that can be analyzed by the BizTalk Migrator tooling, because the MSI gets all the assemblies, all the bindings, all the information, and it creates enough information for us to build an equivalent logic app, or potentially to build an equivalent logic app. There are some other potential ways in which we could analyze a BizTalk application. We could take a Visual Studio solution, or maybe plug straight into the management database on BizTalk. But plugging straight into your management database, that people might not want. If all you've got is your production one, you might not want tooling running in your production environment. And similarly, a Visual Studio solution might be incomplete. So MSIs seemed like a really good compromise between being able to get all the information and being able to run the migration tooling standalone on a developer workstation without need to worry about production environments. So the support, so the migration tool has been tested on BizTalk 2013 R2 Plus, so all the way up to 2020. So yeah, the last three versions of BizTalk, the three supported versions of BizTalk, because obviously, I'm sure you're all very diligent about making sure your BizTalk installations are in support. However, because BizTalk as a product has actually, the core of it has changed only a small amount since some of the early versions, you might find that the migration tooling will work on something exported from BizTalk 2010. It might even work with the older versions like 2006 R2. It hasn't been tested, but it might work. Give it a try. If you've got anything that's that old, give it a try and see where you get to. And again, let us know either through the feedback or through the GitHub issues. So the one of the main ideas of the BizTalk Migrator and the way that it's presented as an open source project is that it's designed to be added to, and it's designed to be added to by the community ideally. So the initial drop of the code supported only 3 adapters of BizTalk: FTP, file, and HTTP. But and that was for both send and receive. But the point of that is that a request receive port or a receive or a single one-way receive or a one-way send, those are fundamental patterns that other adapters are going to follow. So if you're using an SMTP adapter, then that's a one-way send. If you're doing a SQL adapter, that can be a one-way send or it can be a receive. And so the plugin, so the tooling is designed as plugins so that we can add extra support for extra features as we go on. So the initial drop was supporting 3 adapters. Dan will kind of give some update on where that's going in the future. And another thing that's really really useful about the tool, so in the current in its current state, is that it gives you a report of what you've got in your BizTalk application, and it tells you which of those things can be converted and which things can't, what there is support for. And there's a star rating system which goes from sort of 1 to 5 stars. So 5 is that it's fully supported, every feature is supported. 4 stars is that it's partial, so there is a Logic Apps equivalent feature, but it might not have all the properties. And then all the way down to sort of 1 star is this can't, there is no support for this feature, which for things like at the moment of WCF HTTP, those things might come in, those things might not have direct support. There is also support for orchestrations. The way that the BizTalk Migrator conceptually handles orchestrations is really powerful and can be and a scope for massive extension in the future. At the moment, the orchestration support is basic. It will allow you to receive messages, to do transforms and send messages. However, all a lot of the more complicated orchestration features, such as looping, delays, parallel branches, those aren't currently supported, but the placeholders are in there so that they could be in the future. It's orchestrations. When the tool parses a BizTalk application, it will break an orchestration down into every single component shape. What the tool doesn't have is the mapping to generate the code in Logic Apps to support that. But the orchestration is broken down, so it's just a question of how you can plug individual mapping rules in so that we can support those BizTalk orchestrations. And finally, we analyze BizTalk application, generate a report, and then we build a model of what that BizTalk application might look like in Logic Apps, and then generate the resources in Azure. And that's done by creating things like deployment scripts in PowerShell and creating ARM templates for Logic Apps and other Azure resources, so that you can actually, once you've run a conversion, you've got a one line deployment that you can run. You can basically instantiate a PowerShell script, and that will then deploy your BizTalk application as logic apps in Azure, which is a thing of beauty. So that's where we are at the moment. We've let's say the tooling hasn't changed an awful lot since October for a little whilst the feedback has been received. There have been bug fixes gone in and a bit of incremental increases, but the pace is accelerating now. And so I'm going to hand over to Dan now, who's going to tell you about the new stuff that's just about to drop. So
Awesome.
can I hand over to there you are. There you are. I knew you were there somewhere.
Cheers. Thanks, Andrew. Alrighty, so let's talk about roadmap. Let's talk about what's new. So what's new in the tool? Logic App standard supports SFTP adapter, MQ adapter, and SAP adapter. Now, none of this is yet published to Chocolatey, but it will be soon, and we're going to go through it tonight and talk a little bit about what does Logic App standard support, because that's probably the #1 request that has been sent to the team anyway. The SFTP adapter is more of a showcasing how you can extend the existing adapter framework. The MQ adapter is a relatively easy win because the MQ connector is available in both consumption and in standard logic apps. The SAP adapter we'll talk a little bit more because that's kind of a preview and it's currently send only and it's also consumption only at the moment. If you were on the Logic Apps Live last week, the team were talking about what's coming next for Logic Apps Standard. So there is hope that the SAP adapter will be a built-in adapter in the Logic Apps Standard offering. So let's start off by talking a little bit about Logic Apps Standard. So the tool now supports standard as a target. If you've ever looked through the options on the tool, on the command line, you'll see that there used to be a target of consumption or ICE, Integration Service Environment. That's now been replaced with standard. So when you run the tool, you can choose which target. If you don't specify a target, it does default to consumption. That will change later on, so that it will default to standard as a default, and then you can choose whether you want standard or consumption as an output. One of the things it's doing at the moment is that the logic apps that were independently generated by the app are now appearing as workflows in a single standard logic app. And this is something we're going to talk about because architecturally, there's a number of patterns you could apply here. How many different logic apps do you want with how many different workflows in them? There are advantages to having all your workflows in one logic app. They can share access to the same schemas and transforms, and it's easier to call workflow to workflow. But architecturally, it might make sense to split them out. Another thing to think about too is expense, because each logic app is got its own app service plan and therefore is chargeable as a unit as that logic app. Not everything is working yet. For example, the flat file processor is not working because the flat file action in standard logic apps is not there yet. It used to depend on an integration account, and you don't use integration accounts with the new standard logic app. And as of yet, it's not possible to deploy everything locally, because I'm pretty sure quite a few people would have said, brilliant, now I've got logic app standard support, I can fire it up in VS Code and run something completely locally and therefore in a container. But not quite yet, because there's no service bus and there's no app config locally. If you've noticed, you can't run service bus or app config in a container yet. There is API management available to run in a container and therefore locally, but it's a self-hosted gateway and it's very expensive today. So those are some of the stumbling blocks to running everything locally. However, you can run it connected to the cloud connectors, the managed API connectors, so you can debug parts of it locally. And there is an internal conversation about trying to remove the dependency in APIM when executing routes if we can go from workflow to workflow directly. And I'll talk about that a little bit later. So I'm going to take a little segue at the moment and talk about Logic App Standard, the new kid on the block. So interestingly, obviously we've got the product group here as well, so I'm going to be repeating things that they said, and I'm hoping I get it right. But it's a new offering from Microsoft. Basically, your Logic apps are now running on the functions runtime, and it's single tenant as opposed to multi-tenant. So you've got your own set of infrastructure. Consumption Logic apps are multi-tenants, shared infrastructure. It uses an app service plan for pricing. So if you've ever deployed an app service in Azure or a function app, you should be familiar with app service plans. The app service plans that come with Logic App Standard, there's 2 of them. So they're workspace service plans. I can't remember what they're called. Anyway, I think workflow service plans.
Workflow standard plans.
Workflow standard plans, thank you. With a cost associated with them. So what that means is that your Logic app as deployed will have a monthly cost as opposed to a consumption cost. You can develop and run your Logic apps locally in VS Code. I believe there's talk about a Visual Studio extension at some point, but today it's VS Code only. And as a developer, I can't tell you how much easier it is to do development now in VS Code and then deploy up to Azure from there. Some connectors are built in, so things like Service Bus and HTTP and MQ are built into the new runtime, but others you have to connect to the cloud. So the ones that are built in, if you imagine that you can run Logic App Standard in a container, the built-in ones will run inside that container. Anything else, you've got to make a connection back up to the cloud using the existing API connection framework that you all know and love. But one of the big things is that an integration account is no longer needed. So your schemas and maps are deployed as part of your Logic app. They're effectively an app service, so they're deployed as artifacts into a folder. And the actions that we used to use for executing maps or transforms and validating XML, they're all built into the runtime. The one that's missing, though, is flat files, and I'm under the impression that that is coming at some point. Alrighty, so let's talk a little bit about deployment and how it differs, because in consumption, we would have a resource group and we'd have independent Logic apps, and each Logic app is a workflow. So it's in the designer, that's what you'd see, your Logic app. It's deployed as a separate resource in Azure. And then we'd have some API connections, which support the connection actions inside the Logic app, and an integration account as well. And then you might have some other resources like, say, Service Bus, and you might have a function app as well that you're calling. And then inside that function app, you'll have multiple functions. All right, so that's consumption Logic apps as it stands today. Standard Logic apps, we still have a resource group, and we still have all these other things. So we've still got API connection, and, well, you won't use an integration account, but you could create one still for your consumption Logic apps. You still have Service Bus, and you still have your function app. But what's different is that your Logic app now has multiple workflows in it. So everything that used to be a Logic app in consumption is now a workflow in a Logic app. It took me a while to get my head around the change in the use of the word Logic app. And I keep calling it a Logic app service to differentiate it from a consumption Logic app. I'm trying to stop myself from doing that. And it's important to realize that, because this has big impacts on when we migrate from BizTalk. How do we decide to package up what we've generated? Yeah. For example, if I've got a resource group with 15 Logic apps and another resource group with 5 Logic apps and then 2 Logic apps. So if you've used the tool already, you'll know that it splits out some of the core or common functionality. So you've got what we call a message bus, which is core services needed by any message bus service. Then you've got a system application, and that mimics the BizTalk system application, and that's where you find the majority of the common Logic apps. So a JSON encoder and decoder and your XML validator. And then you'll have a resource group per application. So in this case here, imagine we've got this scenario in consumption. What does that translate to when we come to standard Logic apps? Because we could just have a resource group with 1 Logic app with 15 workflows and resource group B with 1 Logic app with 5 and 2 workflows. You can do that. You know, there's no problems with that whatsoever. But you could also have a resource group with 1 Logic app which has 22 workflows in it. It's up to you to decide how you want to split those out. And I'm mentioning this because as we've been working, we're helping Microsoft with working on the migration to standard. One of the decisions to make is how do we allocate all these out? Each of those Logic apps that's running there is running on its own standard plan. And that means there's a monthly cost associated with each of them. So with the tooling, one of the early requirements was to make sure that when you deploy your solution, you're not instantly hit with a really large bill. So the idea is to use either free SKUs or low-cost SKUs, like developer SKUs or something like that. If you were to migrate 15 applications and we were to deploy 17 separate logic apps, each with a cost of whatever that is per month, and you get a big bill, people aren't going to be happy. So there's a balance to find in the middle here in terms of what do we deploy and how much is it going to cost. And I'll talk a little bit about that later and how we've found the balance for now. So there's a few issues around Logic App Standard today, at least from the BizTalk migration point of view. So there's no flat file support, so we can't do flat file encoding and decoding. I was talking about this with the team earlier, but there's no ability to call workflow by expression. So in consumption, if we're in a logic app and we want to call another logic app, there's a logic app action, and that will automatically handle the security aspects and everything. But effectively, it's just an HTTP call. You could also use the HTTP action to call another logic app. In our case, though, in standard, all our workflows are inside the same service, logic app service. So calling from one workflow to another is really simple. There's no security needed or anything like that. And there is a workflow action you can use where you specify the name of the workflow, and it's a drop down. But because the engine needs to know the workflow name at design time, you can't use a variable to work it out. And that's how the routing slip router would work, because it would say, I have now finished executing this workflow. Now I want to go to config and find out what's the next workflow in the pipeline. And it would then call the next workflow. But we can't do that today with Logic App Standard, which means we still have to go out via API management. I'll talk about that as well. I've got another slide to talk about that. We can't use ARM expressions anymore because to calculate parameter values, there's work going on with this as well. But it means that what we used to keep as parameters in our Logic apps, we tend to either put as app settings, where we can still use an ARM template around it. And the whole way that parameters are calculated is still being worked out. There's no tokens and parameter files yet. And there's a single shared parameter file for all workflows in the Logic app. And this was the #1 thing that caused issues because there's a lot of parameters used by all these different Logic apps. So the solution by the tool at the moment is to make each parameter specific to a workflow by prepending or prefixing the name of the workflow to the parameter. So when you look in the parameters.json, which is where you store parameters in Logic App Standard, you see all the names in there. I can show you an example of that. What about integration accounts? So an integration account was a central store for your schemas and maps. And we don't have that anymore. Instead, we've got schemas and maps that are stored as artifacts in each Logic app. But what do you do if you want common schemas and maps? So if I've got a set of 20 schemas that are used by 5 different applications, how do I access those if I have to put those in a core Logic app, but I want my other Logic apps to be in separate, my other workflows, if you like, to be in separate Logic apps? They don't have direct access to those schemas and maps. There are ways around this, obviously, because you could create a workflow that you can be called to look up a schema or a map and execute it inside that Logic app. I'll share a slide on this. But it's one of those things that had to be thought about when looking at migrating to standard. So we also can't use an integration account to look up a schema by message type. So those of you that have worked with BizTalk for a long time know that if you're using, say, the XML validator pipeline component, you don't need to specify the schema you want to use for validation. It's one of the nice features of BizTalk. You just specify that in your custom pipeline, and it will look up the schema by the message type, and where the message type is the namespace and root node name combined for a schema. And the tool, the BizTalk migration tool, implements something similar, but it did it by attaching metadata to the schemas in an integration account. But we don't have that anymore because there's no integration account. So that's something that hasn't been solved. What the tool is doing today is it is still using an integration account just for that metadata. But we're talking about how we might be able to migrate that or move that to config so we don't need the dependency on the integration account. So this information about schemas and map, what I was trying to communicate there is that if you've got an integration account today with your schemas and maps, and you might have a number of different logic apps that are all pointing at that integration account, so they can all access those schemas and maps. But going forwards, if in Logic App Standard, your schemas and maps are inside the Logic App, so all the workflows in that Logic App can access them. But if you've got another Logic App with its own workflows in it, it doesn't directly have access to those schemas and maps. What you'd have to do is call another workflow in Logic App 1 that does have access to the schemas and maps. And that's what we're having to do in the tooling as well. It's thinking about how these things, what I'm trying to show is it's not a simple migration across. There's been a little bit of re-architecting needed to support what the migrator does in its in the generated solution. So a little bit of talk about what gets deployed. So this here is what the tool deploys today, the consumption version. So there's a message bus resource group, which has app config, and it's got integration accounts and API management and key vault and all the rest of it. Then there's a system application, which is mainly made up of logic apps and service bus as well. And then for each of your applications, you get another resource group, which has your receive port, your send port, things like that in it. So what happens though is that in standard, first of all, you don't have the routing slip router. That was sitting in the message bus, so that's been moved up into the system application. So it's another workflow as part of the system application. And in the current iteration of the tool, when you run it and you run the deployment, what you're going to end up with is a much bigger system application. And in that system application, you're going to have a system application logic app. And all the consumption logic apps now appear as workflows in there. So all the, the JSON encoder and decoder and all the rest, they're now workflows inside your system application. But also, you get your applications in there as well. So you get your receive port and your send port and everything like that will all appear in the same system application today. This is just a deployment issue, really. If you want them to be in their own logic app, it's not difficult to do. And this is something that we really need feedback from the community in terms of what they would prefer. There are benefits to this because all your workflows are sitting inside the same logic app. But architecturally, it's not ideal. You might want to separate out your applications, but then you're going to be paying more for each of the logic apps that are running as well. So to begin with, this is the pattern we're going with. So the workflows will all be inside one big logic app to start with. And you have the API connections on the outside as well. So talking a little bit about consumption and how much does it cost, because this question I've seen again and again in relation to the migration tool. So I've done my migration, I've deployed it, what's it going to cost me to run? People asking what should I expect? And how will it change when we move to standard? So today, the migration tool tries to use a free or the lowest cost SKU for every resource that's deployed. So it uses the free SKU for integration accounts and the free SKU for app configuration and a basic API management SKU. It uses consumption for function apps, and then service bus uses standard. There are some conflicts that you can hit where you can only have single, like a single free SKU for a particular subscription or region, specifically with app configuration and integration accounts. And polling also defaults to 30 seconds, and that's a trade-off between latency and cost, because of course this is consumption. So if I'm polling every second, I'm paying for those actions. But when we go to standard, it changes a little bit. So there's no integration account. I mean, there is today, but going forward, there won't be. What's new, though, is that you have a standard workflow plan cost. So you've got a new cost that you'll be paying for monthly. And that will, today, there's not, and unless this has changed recently, there's nothing cheaper than the standard workflow plan for Logic App Standard. That's what you get. But the idea is that the tool won't create multiple logic apps. So you're not going to be paying multiples of whatever the monthly cost is for your standard workflow plan. One of the interesting things, and I realized that this slide could have been updated, is that the polling can decrease to whatever you want because you're not paying per action anymore. As long as your workflow plan has capacity to handle however many actions you're running per second for across all your workflows, you don't have to worry about the cost anymore, which is one good thing. Ready? Let's go and show a demo, as I've been talking for way too long. I am going to switch on over to here, and I'm going to show here what it looks like today. So this is consumption. So we've got a number of different resource groups here. So we've got our message bus resource group and system application, and then we've got one per migrated application. In message bus, we've got app config and some of our functions, our integration account. And then in the system, we've got all the logic apps that handle things like JSON encoding and decoding and all the rest of it. And then in your actual application ones, there's usually not a lot. There's a receive port and send port. So here we've got a logic app that represents the FTP receive adapter. So that's picking up from FTP location. And then we've got a topic subscriber. So that is subscribing to messages from the message bus. And then we've got an FTP send port adapter that sends it back out the other way. So this is what you get with the samples that come with the tool. So this is the FTP pass-through sample. If we go and look at what the tool generates in standard, this is what we have here. So this is the message bus, which hasn't changed. The only thing new you might see is that there's now a new Logic Apps app service plan. So this is the standard workflow plan. That's about the only thing you'll see. There is a logic app in here, a standard logic app, the message bus service, but it's currently empty. And as mentioned, the integration account is still there because we are using it still for metadata. You see things changing, however, when we go and look at the system application. So now the system application still has service bus in there, but it's only got one logic app, and then it's got a number of API connections. And everything is now inside this one logic app. If I open this up, and I come down and look in my workflows. I wait. Now we'll see everything in here. So what we've got is all I've deployed to this at the moment is the FTP pass-through. That's what I ran. So the FTP pass-through consists of a FTP receive adapter, and then there's a topic subscriber and an FTP send adapter. And then all the common logic apps are here as well. In this case here, I've actually removed all the workflows that the tool deployed because I didn't want to be having them pop up when I was doing demos. So everything is deployed inside a single logic app. And if I want to run through and try something out, I can test this scenario by coming over to FileZilla. And I am currently, oh yes, I'm going to do a session at some point talking about how to debug Logic App Standard and how familiar you get with the log files that are going on underneath if something's going wrong. So if you've got a Logic App that or a workflow you've deployed and it's marked as either unhealthy or healthy and there's no workflow URL assigned to it, the log files are your friend. Go and look in there and you'll find an exception, most likely. So if I come down here to outbound and I deploy, say, this one I don't think I've used already. All right, so I've transferred that over. So now if I switch back to the logic app here and I go to, say, the FTP receive adapter here. So bear in mind, this is the same logic app. It's migrated over to standard, but it's exactly the same content internally. What's different about it is that it's in the new structure. So if you've worked with Logic App Standard, now's not the time to talk about it, but in VS Code, the structure that you've got a connections file and a parameters file, all that is there. It's using either managed API connections in this case here, or there are also service connections as well. So if I go to the trigger history, and I can see here, what time is it now? 7:05. So it's run. Now, this is a question I keep meaning to ask the product group when I have them around at some point to find out why from the time it's picked it up to the time it actually kicks off the run is quite significant. It appears to go through 2 polling cycles. So if I wait, you'll see that we'll actually do a second and then a third, and it's the third one that it fires on. I don't know why that is. because it's obviously picked up that there is a file. There we go. So then it does the second, and it's the third one that fires, although it's got the same run ID. So now you'll see it's kicked off and it's running. So this logic app here, or this workflow, to get my terminology correct, it works in exactly the same way as the consumption ones. So we're obviously in the new designer now, and it's going to run through, and it's going to get configuration, and then it's going to check to see should we process the file. So this is kind of cool. This is the new inline JavaScript, which used to require an integration account. It doesn't anymore. It's all run internally in the engine. So what happens here is it's converted the BizTalk file mask to some regex, and it's checking should the file be processed, yes or no. And then it runs through, and then it constructs an envelope around it, and then off it goes to call the routing slip router, which is going to go and publish it to the message box. We've talked in previous sessions about cold and warm start. They still apply. We're still going through functions where you have to wait for it to start up. So the first time through is usually a bit slower than our subsequent ones. But off it goes, it's called that, and eventually it will finish. And what I should see if I come to my topic subscribers, I'll see this kicks off, having picked up there we go, 706, it's run. So that's now picked up the file. And if I come back to FileZilla, hopefully I will see in my inbound a new file at 706. There we go. So that's exactly the same demo that we used to do with consumptions, now running in standard. So now running against these new logic apps. And all the new logic apps are migrated across. If we can go and look in any one of them. So if we go and look and say the content demoter, you'll see that in the designer in here, they're all using the new designer, and they are using slightly different actions when necessary, because as you migrate from one to the other. So as an example, there's currently no API management action. So this here, which in consumption was an API management action, is now an HTTP action. And it looks up, if you have a look at what's going on inside here, you can see that it's because it's a generic HTTP action, there's nowhere to supply the APIM subscription key. So that's now done as a header, and it looks that up from the app settings. I know that Bet talked about this at length, I think, during the integrate session, where app settings are the place if you want something to be worked out at deployment time. So in this case here, I want to look up the APIM subscription key. How do we get that and get that into our configuration? So that is actually part of an ARM template that runs, where it does a lookup. It does something known as list keys on the resource ID of APIM to find out what the subscription key should be. So you don't need to hard code it in. All right, so that's all looking good. And if I show you the runtime here, so when you run the tool, if I do an aim --help, made the font size bigger in here, and we scroll up, we'll see that there is a target option here, which has a new value here of standard. So it used to say consumption and ICE, now it's consumption and standard. So when you choose standard, what it's going to do is anything that's not a logic app will stay as it is. So it will still generate all the ARM templates or the Azure CLI deployment scripts, but it will take all the logic apps and it will generate a project, a logic app project with all the workflows in it and the host.json and everything else that's needed. And then the deployment scripts will then create a zip file of that and deploy it. Now, one thing to note is that this does require the new Azure CLI extension for logic apps, which isn't yet in public released. It's still preview, isn't it, Beck? So if you go to the help file here for Microsoft Docs for single tenant logic apps, you see there is a link down in here for deploying, and under Azure CLI, it'll tell you what you have to do here. So until this is sort of publicly available as one of the extensions in the Azure CLI, you still have to execute this step. I'm thinking it's a good idea probably to update the deployment script so it pops up a message saying this is a dependency. that you have to deploy, because if you don't have this, the deployment of this logic app will fail because it uses the logic app extension for doing deployment. Okay, so that is the standard support, and I will switch back over to the presentation here. Right, I want to talk a little bit about simplifying the routing slip router. This is still an ongoing discussion, but today the way the tool works is it reads a routing slip, and then at the end of each logic app, we will call the routing slip router, which makes a call to the next logic app. That's conceptually what it does. It's how we replicate a pipeline. So if you imagine a pipeline in BizTalk, you're going from one place to another, and it's configurable. So in BizTalk, I can say, well, I want to pick up a file, and then I want to execute a map, and then I've got a pipeline I'm running through. So the tool makes that configurable by using a routing slip to indicate where we go from place to place. And in fact, you can change that routing slip and it will change the behavior of the tool. It's one of the, the benefits of the tool is that it's not hard coded. All these different pieces can be, configured to work together, and you can change that as you go. So how it works today is the receive adapter then calls the routing slip router, which calls the, say, for example, a flat file processor, which would then call the routing slip router to call the XML processor, which calls the routing slip router to call a topic publisher, which then publishes to the message box. And in this case here, what's happening is that the receive adapter doesn't know where the next point in the pipeline is, but the routing slip router does. So it looks up and gets the routing slip and says, right, I know we're going to the flat file processor. And then the flat file processor doesn't need to know where we're going next. So it means that they're all completely independent components. However, to implement this today, the routing slip router needs to go to APIM to get the address of the callback URL for this logic app. Yeah. So it needs to get the signature and the endpoint for this logic app, because it doesn't know what it is in advance. But that means that every call to the routing slip router needs to do that. So we end up with this fairly convoluted way of going from the routing slip router to APIM, back out again to call a flat file, and back out to here, back out to APIM. All the callback URLs are cached in APIM. So it's not like we're going away and looking, and making a call against the management API to get one every single time. But there is latency introduced by this method. What would be nice is that in standard logic apps, all the workflows are in the same logic app. So all of these, are in the same logic app. It would be nice if we could just call them directly. So we could still use the routing slip router, but what it would do is, instead of having to go out to APIM, it would just directly call the flat file processor, because it's a workflow within the same logic app. There's no reason we can't do it. They're all sitting inside the same logic app. They're just workflows within there. So we're not doing that today, but that's the next step. That's the next bit of work that we're going to be looking at doing to try and see if there's a way of making this work. The hope is that by doing this, we can drastically reduce latency, because this is something that is being looked at for the next, sort of financial year, later this year, is looking at what can we do to make the generated or the migrated application more performant. Because if you've seen the examples today, we get latency that's generally larger than with BizTalk when you're looking at 1 or 2 messages. Although, as we talk about, once you start ramping up the number of messages, the latency on BizTalk will go up, but the latency here in these generated solutions won't. What we'd like to be able to do is start decreasing the latency. One of the ways we could do that is with this. One of the other ways is starting to look at stateless logic apps and how they might influence latency as well. Right, let's talk a little bit about the new adapters. So SFTP, so send and receive, consumption only so far. There's no built-in SFTP connection for the new runtime. So there will be a standard version of the send and receive adapters, but it will still be using the managed API connectors. It will work the same way as BizTalk. Not all properties are mapped, but it's a fairly simple thing, and I've seen it working at a few clients. MQ is quite a low-hanging fruit, if you like, because we can do send and receive. It is consumption only, even though there is support in the runtime for it. In the standard runtime, there is an MQ action. So the MQ standard version will come out fairly soon, I would imagine. There's no trigger for MQ as far as I'm aware today, at least in consumption, so it's using recurrence. Now SAP's quite a big one, so that's in preview. Even when this gets released, it's send only for now, and we could do a whole separate session. We need to get David Berg on to talk about SAP connector. It's a wonderful connector. The team have done some brilliant work with it, but you need to be a pretty hardcore SAP head to get your head around some of what it does. There's going to need to be a little bit of attention to differentiate between calling IDOCs or BAPIs or RFCs, because the way that BizTalk does it is inferred, whereas the way that the connector does it in Logic Apps is direct. So you have to specify in advance which one you want to call. Am I calling a BAPI? Am I calling an IDOC, an RFC? And there are some preview ones, some preview actions within the connector where it will try and work it out for you. The other thing is that today it does require the on-premise data gateway. I think last week on Logic Apps Live, it was mentioned that the SAP connector is going to become a built-in connector for Logic Apps Standard. Did I hear that right? Yes, I'm seeing tentative nodding. All right.
Potentially, yes.
Potentially, okay. So if that happened, it would mean that I'm guessing we wouldn't need the on-premise data gateway anymore. It should be a nice requirement because it's a bit of, once you've got it set up and running, it's not too bad. But one of the things that I know a lot of our clients want is the ability to be running Logic Apps, eventually in a container, say, Arc-enabled Kubernetes cluster that you're running on-prem, and you're going directly to a local SAP cluster or instance. So what you'll see when the tool runs is there are new receive and send port analyzers. So previously there was just FTP file and HTTP. Now we have SFTP, MQ, and SAP on both receive and send. And that means that when you get the report, you now start seeing more things supported if you happen to have SAP or MQ in your exported application. One thing to talk about briefly, and I think we probably need to have another session to talk about the SAP support, is the difficulty in mapping the BizTalk bindings through to a SAP adapter. And this is an example of how it's done here, is that with BizTalk it's done via operations. So in this case here, this is a BizTalk application that calls one of 3 BAPIs. And they're represented in an orchestration as 3 separate operations in a single send port. Yeah. And then in the binding file, the BizTalk looks at the operation to work out what's the action that is going to be used when the SAP adapter is called. The SAP connector works slightly differently. So what the tool has to do is try and guess which action on the SAP connector we're going to use, and it's not guaranteed to get it right. So it's one of those adapters where that's why it's in preview at the moment. It's going to need a lot more testing with a lot more clients. So if you are interested in helping test the SAP support, please use the feedback survey or please contact the product group. We should have put up an email address, Beck, or something like that we could use to contact. In fact, maybe we'll stick that up and we'll put that on the slides at the end so people can see who to contact. Alrighty, roadmap. What's coming next? That's what we've got so far, and that's what's about to be released. But what's happening over the next sort of 4, 5, 6 month period? This is what's on the backlog. So this is not guaranteed, but this is what we're talking about doing. And again, this is where we need feedback. The top 3 pieces of feedback that the product group have got in terms of new features is WCF, Business Rules Engine, and usually SSO. Something that popped up during one of the conferences we were at was the BizTalk deployment framework. I know the majority of clients I've been to use that, and somebody asked the question, well, could we just use one of those MSIs? Because if you're using the BizTalk deployment framework and say you're using DevOps pipelines, you've already got the MSIs. You don't need to go to your server to export them. You physically have the MSIs already because that's part of your pipeline. So you can just use those. So that should be a fairly simple thing to get added in. WCF, basic HTTP, and web HTTP. Again, web HTTP should be fairly simple. Basic HTTP is an interesting one in that adding support for, say, accepting a SOAP message and unwrapping it to get to the body, and then putting the headers on and then actioning the SOAP action. That in itself isn't too difficult to do, but it's all the stuff that WCF gives you around the surroundings that be tricky. What if you're using Windows authentication? Well, that's not going to be supported. Basic authentication, great. So that could be supported, but where is the username and password going to be, stored? Would you expect that to be a text file that's in your Logic app? Would you expect that to be in a SQL database and the tool supports deployment to a SQL database? Or would you want it in AAD? But then you're going to end up with all your accounts in AAD. Is that what you want? Or do you want a choice between all those? So those are the sorts of things being looked at. Support for HTTPS and the transport and message protocols as well. So there'll be certain things that are fairly easy to do. If you've got a fairly standard basic HTTP setup, then it'll get migrated across. Anything more will need a bit more work. Web HTTP, well, that's JSON, as long as you're not using any of the specific WCF features around there. And to be honest, I haven't yet come across a BizTalk project that is using hardcore WCF with the Web HTTP adapter. Business Rules Engine is an interesting one. We probably could have a whole separate session on what that would look like. I know the team have been bundling around with some ideas to see what could be done, and watch this space. But it's definitely on the backlog for doing next. Okay, that's pretty much it. I'm going to stop with a picture of Lake Wanaka in New Zealand. And open up, I guess, for any Q&A that might have come through.
Thanks, Dan. No Q&A yet, but we'll keep it open for a couple of minutes if anyone has any questions.
Oh, brilliant. I can see you've put that address down there. So biztalkmigration@microsoft.com. And you know what? I'm going to do a cheeky edit right now. And I am going to stick this in the middle of this live. I'm going to, I can't do it from here. Right,
Magic of television.
Magic of television, yeah. I just got to think about ruining my lovely picture here.
Or enhancing it.
Or enhancing it, you're quite right. So yes, BizTalk migration at Microsoft. So if you've got feedback, if you want to be involved in the SAP preview, if you want to help the product group to test the SAP connector, please get in touch via this email address. If there's a feature that you really need, so if you would consider migrating from BizTalk today, but there's a feature you really, really need, email the team. Either use that link we showed earlier on to get to the survey, or email the team via this email address here. I know from experience they're very receptive to ideas, but it depends on what's involved and everything like that. Alrighty.
No more. Oh, there we go. We've got one.
Is there one here? So, yeah,
yes.
SAP RFC connector. Does that have to be different from the BizTalk SAP adapter? So again, we could have quite a long conversation about this, but the SAP connector in Logic Apps is, now without David here, I don't know that we can talk about internally how it works, unless Derek knows, because I don't think it's built on exactly the same framework, although I think it's still using the SAP.NET connector, but it implements everything that BizTalk does plus more. So it's actually a superset, as I understand it. It's a superset of what you can do with the BizTalk adapter, which is, so Bex just put a link to the migration survey in the comments as well on YouTube. So it's different in that the tool has to try and work out what you were doing with SAP, and then implement that in a connector in Logic Apps. And it doesn't, from my experience, it doesn't always get it right. So unlike most of the other connectors, where say the file connector is fairly simple, you've got a set of properties and you can just go and copy this across. The SAP one is slightly different because there's so many different things you can and can't do, that there's so many different actions on the SAP connector that the tool's going to try and work out which of those actions BizTalk is actually implementing, because there's not enough information in the MSI file for it to work it out, in the binding file at least. One of the enhancements we can do is often with a SAP scenario, you've got an orchestration and you've generated schemas. So with the SAP adapter, it's one of those ones where you generate schemas for your BAPIs or your IDOCs, yeah? And then in your orchestration, you're generating an instance of one of those schemas and you're sending it out a send port. And you're using a particular operation, and that operation is used to identify to the SAP adapter which BAPI, for example, you're calling, or which IDOC, or the RFC. That there is mapped across to an equivalent in the tool. But again, it's a preview at the moment, and we need as many different MSIs to test it and see what happens to expand support for it. Because what we're looking for is the edge case scenarios. We're trying to cover as many common scenarios as we can, but someone will always have an edge case.
Cool. Well, I think we're almost at the half-hour mark, so it's been an awesome session. Happy to wrap up there if there's no more questions. As you can see, we've got lots of stuff coming for the BizTalk migration tool. We can't wait to actually have this available for you to use in Chocolate. So yeah, like I mentioned, like the teams mentioned, get on the BizTalk survey if you have any feedback, try out the tool, give us all the feedback you have, and we do listen. So yeah, we can't wait to see what happens next. So thanks everyone for joining the call. And yeah, enjoy July, and we'll see you at the end of the month.
Okay, thanks everyone. Bye now.
Thank you all.
Thanks all.